Early in life, Howard Roscoe Driggs developed two great passions: history and education. The two pursuits combined to preserve the lessons of the past and the construction of the future. And for Howard, they became constant and cherished companions as he strode through a life of service to others, those of the past, the present, and the future.
He was a distinguished educator who had a passionate interest in the preservation of the history of the West. He inspired others through his teaching, through his books, teacher training for English teachers. He was chairman of the English department in the New York University School of Education, and at the same time he was president of the Oregon Trail Memorial Association, which later became the American Pioneer Trails Association.
Howard R. Driggs began as an English educator and became a historian in the process. They asked him why he was always talking about history in his English education classes, and he said, "English is a transportation system, and I don't want my train running with a bunch of empties." And so he, more and more, became involved in history, and it became his passion. My own father used to say, history is not history until it's written, and he was determined to record as much of those kinds of things as he possibly could.
Grandfather was a wonderful man. He loved people, he loved teaching, he loved storytelling. He took us on trips, and one of the things that he did was put markers on the trails that led to the West. He appreciated the people who came here. He wanted to tell their stories, and he wanted to make sure they stayed alive.
I think he was just a little kid at heart. He wanted to go on these adventures that he wrote about. He wanted to participate in those adventures, have some of his own, and he did. He traveled all over the country.
He also had an early movie camera, and he would take movies of a lot of us. And he took movies of a lot of things. He wasn't one who painted pictures like his brother William King Driggs. He took movies, and one day somebody said, "Mr. Driggs, Dr. Driggs, how can you afford all these movie stuff?" He said, "Well, you notice I don't smoke." And he said, "Well, yes." He said, "This is my tobacco money."
His parents and grandparents had been trail pioneers, and growing up in Pleasant Grove, he was fascinated hearing their stories of their trail experience, of the hardships they had endured, and the experiences of settling in the West. And it became very passionately interested as a child in preserving these stories. And as a 10-year-old, he was in a bookstore in Pleasant Grove and saw a book about 100 years of American independence.
This is the one that had, you've seen what he wrote inside it? Is that the one? Oh, here it is. Yeah. This is a good story about grandfather.
And he desperately wanted to buy the book. It was $5, and finances were limited in his family, so he got a job working for a home builder, making 25 cents a day. And when he had accumulated $2.50, he went to the bookstore to buy it, and the owner reminded him that the book cost $5, and he was devastated.
And he said, "I would like to buy this book. Will you sell it to me for what I've got, and my father will guarantee the rest, and I'll pay you the rest when I earn it." And the store owner looked at him and he said, "Howard, I know you. I know your father. I can trust you for it." So he got it. And that, he said, started him on his love of history.
It was his cherished possession, and it's now in the Driggs collection at the university in the Howard R. Driggs room. He would read these stories about history, and he was so fascinated by them, he would get his friends to join him and play different roles of historical figures, and they would have little reenactments in the town square. And this just became a lifelong passion of his, of preserving the stories of history, and it drove his behavior and motivation throughout the rest of his life.
Howard attended Brigham Young Academy, where he was inspired to become a teacher. Armed with a teacher's diploma, he taught in the Pleasant Grove public schools in the early 1890s, before entering the University of Utah, from which he graduated in 1897. He later took his bachelor's and master's degrees from the U, and in 1926 earned a doctorate of philosophy degree in education from New York University. His profile as a sterling educator and historian had been distinctively earned.
Howard Driggs was one of the first 4 faculty members at Southern Utah University. That's back in the day when they were like the librarians and the president and the recruiters and the bookkeepers and everything.
He came here in 1897, about 3 days after he had married his first wife. They loaded up all their goods in Wagon and came down. So he and his first wife, Eva Driggs, came down to Southern Utah University. Then it was the Branch Normal School. Howard and Eva often had people in their homes, the students in their homes, and they would serve them meals and give them advice, not only as an educator, but just as a person.
That's what he was after, human growth and development. And we need more educators like that today. He was teaching people. He wasn't just teaching English construction and historical fact. He was building people.
Howard, along with Milton Benyon, who was officially the principal of the school and who taught pedagogy and history, comprised the founding 4, along with Annie Spencer, teacher of music, physical education, and reading, and George William Decker, who taught mathematics and physical science. Normal schools trained high school graduates to be teachers, and their purpose was to establish teaching standards or norms, hence the name. The Driggses bid farewell to the BNS, and when they left, they did so knowing that they had made a potent difference in the lives of scores of students, while helping in great measure to form the future of the fledgling school.
He had that sense of adventure about him. His mother sometimes would refer to him as Horrid Rascal Driggs, rather than Howard Roscoe Driggs. But he was adventuresome, he was curious, he wanted people to be up and doing things. He wanted the family to add luster to their names. He just saw a responsibility to teach the family and to teach others so that each succeeding generation would be better than the next. This was a consuming passion, how to teach young people. And the older he got, the more concerned he became about America's youth. He saw life as something that was a gift and that should be well used, and that you only had so much time to get things done. And the one time when I think annoyed him just a little bit, I said, "Uncle Howard, be careful." He said, "What do you mean by that?" I said, "Well, you're getting a little older." And he said, "Don't you think I know that?" And then he realized I'm talking to a high school kid, and he paused and he said, "Listen, the first 100 years are the hardest. Very few people die after 100. But he was determined to live life to the fullest, and work was one of the things that made it to the fullest.
He was strongly motivated to inspire children to understand history and appreciate our past. And he adapted a lot of the stories that he had preserved in books for younger readers. And it was very important to him because I think he realized that he had developed this passion as a child, and he wanted other children to do so as well.
Grandfather was coming, it was near the end of the school year, but he was coming on his way west from New York. stopped for a couple of days and stayed at our house. So as I was studying, I said, "Grandfather, I need to remember all of these things." And I started telling him about some of the books that we had read. And here he quotes passages from some of these books I'd just been studying, and he probably hadn't read them for years. And I was amazed. And I said, "Grandfather, how do you remember that, all those things?" And he said, "When I want to remember an idea or a thought, I give it away and give it away and give it away until it's mine." He teaches it, gives it away. That's a thought I'd never forgotten.
There's an elementary school in Holiday, Utah, in the Granite School District that was named after him. The school opened in 1965, and my mother attended the dedication of the school. I had the honor of speaking there at a ceremony they had for it was the 50th anniversary of the school. And it's very inspiring how they've carried on the recognition of his legacy and with their books, and they have a sculpture of him in the lobby.
Very, very steeped in American history. Very, very connected with Southern Utah University, both he and his family. And interested in the broader politics of America. And very, very engaged in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints.
He told me once that people would ask him, why didn't he move back from New York to Utah? And he said, because the church would keep me too busy. He said that facetiously. But nevertheless, he was very busy all the time we were in New York with church activities, writing for church publications and speaking. And I recall going through his correspondence. He got a letter on a Wednesday asking him if he could preside over the church service on that Sunday in Washington, D.C., and he was there. And he was very devoted to everything that he undertook. And I truly don't know when he slept. As he wrote all these books and traveled in the summer to all these historical events in the West.
He loved stories. He loved this pioneer heritage that he had. As an English professor, he had summers off. What do you do in the summer? You look for adventures. We do that now. And I think part of marking the trails was that adventurous spirit in him as he would go around and visit the sites and visit with the people and work with the people.
And I went on at least 2 trips with him as a young man. One of the trips we went was with a group of people who were associated with the American Pioneer Trails Association. And there was a group of 25 or 30, and we traveled different parts of a trail. We met an Indian chief, but he came up to Grandfather and he said to him, "Dr. Driggs, would you write my book? Write my story?" And Grandfather was a little startled, and I kind of was amazed at seeing this Indian chief. And Grandfather said, "Well, why do you want me?" He said, "Why do you want a book? Why do you want your story?" He said, "Because white men's books never forget." And I chuckled. I'd never forgotten that. And he's true. He wanted those stories to be true. The Indians appreciated them. And he knew that Grandfather would write an accurate story of his tribe, his life, whatever. But I was not that old, but I still remember, because when you see an Indian chief all dressed up, it sticks with you.
I said to him once, "Uncle Howard, why don't you move back to Utah?" He said, "I've never left. I've just expanded its borders." I don't know whether I'd call him a workaholic or not. I would call him somebody who knew that things needed to be preserved, and if they weren't preserved, they'd be forgotten. He understood that very clearly.
He wrote books to preserve the stories of trail pioneers and the Pony Express riders. In the 1920s in New York, he became the editor of the World Book Company's Pioneer Life series. It was a series of about 10 or 12 books where he sought out people that had special stories to preserve, William Henry Jackson, Ezra Meeker, and others that pursued his goal of preserving their stories.
Perhaps his most enduring work in this regard, begun while he was at NYU, was his presidency of the Oregon Trail Memorial Association, beginning in 1928. He was tenacious in his efforts to elevate the movement begun by Ezra Meeker to preserve and mark the Oregon Trail. He was instrumental in the organization's expansion of its mission to the Pony Express, Mormon, Santa Fe, and other Western trails as it became the American Pioneer Trails Association in the late 1930s. Howard Driggs received an abundance of acclaim for his leadership and was received at the White House by 3 presidents: Herbert Hoover, Franklin D. Roosevelt, and Dwight D. Eisenhower.
In 1930, President Hoover signed a proclamation of the covered wagon Centennial, and it did 2 things. It honored Ezra Meeker on the 100th anniversary of his birth, and it also commemorated the 100th anniversary of the first trek across what later became the Oregon Trail. And the highlight of the year was the celebration at Independence Rock on July 4th. And it was just a massive celebration. There were various estimates of the attendance. They went as high as 10,000 people. And he was a magnificent speaker and very inspiring. And people admired the devotion that he expressed in his talks and the way he inspired them with a love of history and love of preserving it.
He was a frequent guest on radio programs in New York in the early days of radio, telling stories of the West and enthralling many thousands of listeners who otherwise had little idea about what was out there. His colorful manner of storytelling brought to life those times and those who made them a hallmark of American history.
Later, the Trail Association conducted a program of marking the Oregon Trail, and later also became involved in marking the Pony Express Trail. And then in 1935, it was the 75th anniversary of the Pony Express. There was a relay of scouts on horses that went from Sacramento back to St. Joseph, Missouri, carrying mail that had been addressed to President Roosevelt by governors of states along the trail route. My stepfather arranged for an Army airplane to fly the mail onto Washington, and he rode on the plane with William Henry Jackson and some other officers of the association, and they had a ceremony on the White House lawn where they presented this mail addressed to President Roosevelt.
He contributed to a wide variety of publications, dozens upon dozens of articles on the history of America and the men and women who pioneered the American West. And his prolific authorship of 50 books spanned virtually all of his adult years. His writings spanned a wide spectrum of his interests, emblazoned with what he determined were essentials of educational life and history. Among his works was a series of highly successful textbooks for English teachers, entitled Live Language Lessons.
Eva Frampton Driggs was the bride of his youth, his first wife. They had just celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary, and 4 days later, she passed away. I don't know what went through his mind in all of those cases, but at some point he found Margaret. She was interested in the same sort of things that he was interested in. She'd been involved in the Oregon Pioneer Trail thing, and she was, I think, maybe a president of a state organization, and she had been a writer for the Kansas City Star, and they met, and they fell in love, and they married, and she was especially kind to him, and I think stretched his life. And Camille always addressed him as Daddy. She refers to him now as my stepfather, but the love went much deeper than that.
Janet Segmeller, who was my predecessor, she was the Special Collections Librarian before I became Special Collections Librarian. In about 2004, she was asked to speak at a conference, and she was doing some research in another collection we have, the William R. Palmer collection. In her research, she came across letters between Howard R. Driggs and William R. Palmer. They were about the same age, and they had many of the same interests. And Janet became curious as to where Howard R. Driggs's papers were. She thought it would be interesting to look at his side of the story in their conversation back and forth. And as she began to look around, she couldn't find the papers anywhere, any of the institutions that she was familiar with. And of course, Janet knew that Howard R. Driggs worked with the Pioneer Trails, was a historian, and also his connection here at the university. It was kind of fortuitous. About this same time, Camille Bradford, who was Howard R. Driggs's stepdaughter, was looking for a place to house her stepfather's collection.
I've been very grateful for the opportunity I've had to organize his collection prior to its acquisition by Southern Utah University, and grateful for the opportunity to work with the people at the library who are involved in the preservation of the collection.
It's just a really nice fit to have Howard's collection here, and it kind of feels like he came home. He started out here, and now his papers are ending up here, so it's just a really good fit for our university.
Howard died in February 1963 and was honored as one of Utah's most illustrious sons in remarks to the United States Senate by Senator Frank Moss. An editorial in the Salt Lake Tribune stated in part, "American awareness of the role of the West in U.S. history is largely due to the work of scholars like Howard R. Driggs, who died in New York Sunday at the age of 89.
Camille Bradford and Alan Christensen, both members of Howard Driggs' family, decided that they would like to honor the university and do something so that we could remember Howard Driggs. And so they started the Howard Driggs Lecture Series. And the lecture series has been going on now for 12 years. It has become the university's premier lecture series, where we bring in a guest speaker every spring to talk during our Founders Week. And it's been a spectacular series. We've had 6 historians, 2 of whom are Pulitzer Prize winners. We've had a screenwriter who's talked about preserving history. We've had a couple politicians, an ambassador to the United Nations, all of them focusing really on the things that Howard Driggs was interested in, which is the American West, and in particular the history of the American West, and American politics in the broader sense.
It's been a great pleasure to have them speak and call attention both to their work and to the Driggs collection and what it represents. I know that if he were alive today, he would be grateful for the way the university has progressed to what it is today, and he would be very grateful for the opportunity to have been involved in the founding of it.
I just graduated from high school. I was interested in agricultural activities, and I was trying to get a small cattle herd started. And he wrote this. He wrote this: "With every good wish to Alan, your success and interest in the story of the great cattle industry will be enriched through this little book. It goes back to the beginnings. Our congratulations and best wishes always, Uncle Howard and Aunt Margaret. That meant a lot to me. He wanted me to reach out and go places. Here's a man who's my great uncle, who's interested in my growth and development, and he takes time to pen a note like that. I suppose he sensed keenly that it was important that you spend your life on something that would outlast it. And clearly, the books that he wrote and the message they've carried outlasted his life and have become collector's items because of the message they carry and the feelings they generate. And I think that would have pleased him.
I was very touched. He dedicated one of his children's books to me, Pitch Pine Tales. And I was just it was just a wonderful, wonderful life growing up with him. And I felt truly blessed by all the devotion that he had and the way that it influenced my thinking. I developed an appreciation of the history of the West and the role that he had in the preservation of the legacy of the pioneer trails.
And so now this place, founded in 1897, in the middle of the desolate West. We drive around through Zion Canyon National Park and Bryce and Cedar Breaks, and we're all dressed nice in our fancy gear that protects us from the elements, air-conditioned cars, and carrying around our fancy cameras. We have a hard time getting a real concept of what it was like in the 19th century to make a living down here. It's just totally different. And in the middle of that, we have the start of this college, soon to become university, with a few people who grew up in these really small rural towns, who have experienced so many things. And this year, as we continue to move through the pandemic, in the early part of the college's history, the college was closed for the Spanish flu, the pandemic of 1918 and 19. The buildings were closed, students were sent home, and the college turned into a hospital of sorts where we took care of everybody. Just a really fascinating period of time in our history. So we go from this very, very rural outpost, sort of a branch campus of the University of Utah, until today, where we have students from 56 countries around the world, hundreds and hundreds of students from every continent except for Antarctica. All 50 states are represented, all the counties from Utah. What Howard Driggs saw at the genesis of this university has become something of a worldwide force. I think he'd be proud to show up one day and say, look where this has gone. And gratefully, Camille Bradford and Alan Christensen and Kathleen have helped us preserve the memory of Howard Driggs as we continue on forward.
Howard R. Driggs is profoundly deserving of our love, gratitude, and respect, and Southern Utah University proudly carries forth this important and valued recognition each year as an intrinsic element of its Founders Week. Professor Driggs truly knew the crucial importance of education and history, and that together they reinforce the knowledge and experience of the past to ensure a promising future, not only for our world, but for each of us as individuals.